afternoon and welcome to Dalmally railway station, where things are a little bit quiet here at the moment. We've decided to make up for all of that, and we're going to help you by giving you things to do when you are on lockdown. Today we're going to be using silk tissues, and we're going to be creating something that's quite spectacular for something so small. So ideally you're going to end up with a beautiful flower, three-dimensional and sculpted, and the beginning of the whole thing is this very flimsy, very delicate, certainly sticks to everything, silk tissue. What's a silk tissue? Well, silk is from the silk moth, and this is taken from the cocoon and formed into squares, very open. People from spin from it, people do all sorts of things with it. We've developed a little kit to help you, because sometimes just having the right equipment is very difficult. We're using beautiful ranges of colours today. We're going to do a pink and purple flower. The whole thing is with this, we've created this way, the simplistic way to make a very thin, flat piece of felt that's then sculpted. So you might notice that I'm using my hands and I'm pulling. There's a big gap between here. If I go here, it'll be very hard to do if I take my tops. And this is your first piece of terminology. This is known as wool tops, and this is merino wool that I'm using at the moment. Wool tops is all carded in one direction, so it's quite easy to pull out nice thin pieces. And what I'm doing here is I'm actually overlapping. Each time I put a piece down, I'm taking this firmer inside piece, and like as if it's a star, all going from this center point where everything is overlapping. The reason for that is when we make our flower, we want this center portion to be as strong as possible. This is what holds the strength of the flower. The flower is overlapped with layers of wool by laying it in this direction, and we end up with something that's beautifully firm. We're laying out a second color, and again, tiny, minute amounts. This is a gorgeous combination with some silk and a few different colors. There's a blue and a purple and reds and oranges. Now, as in nature, though nature has very often 4 petals, if we make anything with 4 in it, it's going to look a little square. That may be your choice with the flower that you're trying to do, but traditionally as a florist we would use 3, 5s or 7s, and that gives you a more rounded shape. We've probably got enough of the firm wool on it, so really just now I'm looking for a little bit of colour. To contrast, I'm going to use a little bit of this purple, and you can see I'm just pulling out little tiny pieces, nothing too dense, just adding a little bit of detail. You might be tempted to put all your pattern on the very inside here, but actually it's completely the opposite. When we look at the flower, we're looking down the throat. Here's a different kind. We're looking down the throat of the flower, and everything that's put in this center piece disappears. So there's no point in putting a lot of detail in the center of the flower. What we would really like to do is put that detail towards the outside. And we'll have a little look here just now, and we can see that that contrast has just given us a little bit of three-dimensionality in its own sense. Inside in the little packs I've included lots of different silks. I've included some locally dyed and grown blue-faced Leicester wool, which we use quite a lot. And the thing I love most about felt making, of course, is the texture you can get with it. So we use blue-faced Leicester to give it just that little bit of a lift. There's lots and lots of different wools we can use. Here we've got a dyed pieces, and we dye much of the wool here at the studio, we use a lot of natural dyes, but we also use acid wool dyes, and this particular one is in acid wool dye. Big strong purple, and we've just about got enough wool on it now. So we've got a light covering, nothing too full, and then we're using the piece of net, and the piece of net I have been using for 15 years now. It's windproof membrane, now sold as damp proof, or Rockoline at the garden centre is often used for debris netting. So it's something that's quite easily attainable. It's plastic coated, so it'll last you for years and years. And some of the original pieces I still have from over 15 years. It's a very useful piece of equipment because it's protecting the wool from me. So the only other ingredient I'm going to need, I have put my towel underneath now. I initially forgot to do that, and once the flower was protected I could slip the towel underneath. And then the next magic ingredient is just plain water. It's warm water, it's not too hot, and I'm using a recycled plastic container that's got a non-slip grip here. This is ideal if I'm doing big pieces, and the very top of the lid has been hammered with little holes, little nail holes, and this is really quite good fun because you can get all sorts of different flow from it. The other ingredient I'm using that isn't essential, believe it or not, to felt making, but does make the job an awful lot easier, and that's soap. The soap I use, I've been using for as long as I've been felt making, and it's from Carney Soapery in Kirkintilloch. I find it's got natural oils, it's a cold press soap, and it works very, very well for me. So at first I'm just using my soapy hands and I'm pressing the moisture into the wool, and the soap is doing two things. It's opening up the scales so that the wool can absorb the water, but also it's acting as a lubricant for me. So the very first movement I make is a circular movement, and always a circular movement. If I was inclined to push like this, I'm going to push the fibres apart and most likely end up with a hole. So just gentle little fingertips at first. We're just being very, very gentle. We're going to go all the way around and making sure even the piece that's next to you, that's often forgotten. If I feel I need a little bit more water, I'll just put on a little bit more water. The towel is absorbing any excess, and there's not anything that you can do wrong with this. You can put lots and lots of soap and make it very sudsy. Sometimes that's a little difficult to work with, but all you need to do to rectify that is just pop a little towel on top and just soak up the excess. So I've got all of this moisturized now. It feels nice and flat under my hands, and of course the thing about the net is I'm holding the edges of the flower as well. I can pick it up and I can turn it over. And often when we make felt, we feel that it's really, really wet in the front, but when we go and look at the back of the piece, it can often need a little bit more moisture. So I'm adding a little bit more soap, putting the soap away so it doesn't get too soapy, and then again doing my little circular motion, a little bit firmer on the back because I'm not working directly on the pattern. That's fine. I can turn it back over to the front, and at this stage let's have a little look. Sometimes it'll catch on the edge of the net and I just flap it down, and you can begin to see how those colours might end up merging together. We've got a little yellow silk in here as well that was in the pack, and although it sort of dissolves into nothing when it's wet, as soon as it's dry I know that this is going to come back up. I could continue to rub it with my hands, and there's no right or wrong way. All we're doing is we're providing friction to make the felt processing work faster. What I find for me is it's also an exfoliant for my hands. if I feel that this is maybe too intense on my hands, and some people have quite sensitive hands, we can use all sorts of devices. We can use a little bit of net, and we can use the net to rub on top. There's all sorts of ways. And the nice thing about felt making is you adapt it to suit you. It doesn't mean that this is always the way that we do it. This is the way I do it. This is the way that works for me. So just now I'm just taking a little minute or two to roll up the fibre, and I'm going to roll it backwards and forwards. Now we talked about friction. So moisture and friction are the two things that make felt. And there's lots and lots of lovely old stories of the origins of felt, but we do know that it's at least 600 BC. There's amazing finds in Pazyrak, in the old tombs found in the permafrost on the Russian-Mongolian border. And we do know that back then they had quite a lot of felting skills. In Great Britain, it's quite a modern, believe it or not. We find that possibly it's only since 1976, when a very famous lady in our line of business, Mary Burkett, who sadly is no longer with us, Mary discovered felt making with her own curiosity when she was travelling abroad. And after the very first exhibition down in Cockermouth in Windermere, Mary opened up the eyes of the world to a new craft here in Britain. Of course, Scandinavian countries and other European countries have had this tradition for quite a long time. So with the felt, this is actually really, really strong. And the secret ingredient to this is that silk tissue. And the reason for this is because it's got a crisscross pattern, a formation which holds all the felt quite firmly together. We could, of course, use a piece of fabric, a nice open weave piece of fabric. And in some cases, when I do make my felt and I use my scarves, this is a sort of a shimmery silk I've used here. So sometimes this silk tissue can be substituted by using a nice piece of fabric. So what do we do next? We have made a flat piece of felt. We can see that everything's adhered quite firmly to it. And the next stage is using a very fancy tool called our hand, and we're centering the flower over this cupped section, and we're going to poke down the center. So the area that we want to work on is this section here. We're not worried about the petals on top, and we're just rolling backwards and forwards in our hand, not having any effect here on the top section. You can roll it up, you can roll it down, you can find your own method to do this. Sometimes if we've been a bit zealous on the soap suds, it's quite difficult to get that started. So what we would do is we would use a towel and we would just catch all that excess soapy suds. The drier piece of felt is actually much, much easier to roll, and we would roll backwards and forwards. So this is the initial stage we would be working with. And I think what might be a good idea is if I make this video in 2 parts, then it's not for so long for you to sit and watch it. So every now and then I'm going to open up, because what we can see is happening is the felt is actually felting to itself. And we're going to use our next magic tool, and that's our thumb. So we're going to get the center of the flower and we're going to ease it open and gently place our thumb inside. And I'm holding this section here with my fingers, and I'm just gently tugging, just turning out, gently tugging. I'm stretching back out that piece that has been felted. We want the optimum length of this so that we get a beautifully sculpted flower. So I'll do that several times. I'll be rolling backwards and forwards quite a lot, and then we'll find that it will become stiff enough to actually hold these upper petals. You can see here at this stage we have some overlapping. We may want to accentuate this, or we may want to ease that out when we come to do the portion with the sculpting and the finishing and the finalizing with making the stamens. Even now you can see it's rather a beautiful flower. There's a nice complement of different shading there. There's contrast. This would be a very beautiful flower. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I'll finish this off, and you can come back to me and I'll let you know a little bit more about the finishing process. Thank you for joining me today.